go ahead and get started. We do have an announcement.
The cards that we send out every month to the shut-ins are on a table in the lounge, and if any of you would go in and sign them, we really would appreciate it, and so that we can get those in the mail this week. And a hello from Mary and Sherry Stitt. They popped in to visit with me on Wednesday for a little while. She's looking great.
Thank you, Mary. All right, well, welcome. If people start to funnel in a little while, please try to make some room. We have a few less chairs set up today. I didn't know this, but we'll make sure that next week has enough chairs. Let's go ahead and get started with the word of prayer, shall we? Lord, no matter what state we happen to be in, we know that you are a God who does not change, that you are stalwart, that you are strong, that you are love, that you are the giver of all good things, and for this we give thanks. Lord, meet us here in whatever state we are in. Lord, meet us and give us compassion for the journey. Give us truth to lay hold on. And help us to be faithful stewards of the life that you have given us. We ask this in your Son's name. Amen. All right, well, last week, before a stalwart gentleman stood up and reminded me it was choir time. Thanks again for doing that. We were a couple slides away from finishing, but those slides were worth taking some time on, so we'll finish that today, and we'll start in on part one of the biblical witness. Now, if you have not been with us before, this is our third session in an 8-week-long series on LGBTQ lives and Christianity. And so the agenda here isn't much of an agenda. It's simply to, as I've said, raise the level of interaction with the issues related to the church and LGBTQ lives, so that we can, as a congregation, develop an informed and compassionate response. We don't know what that response will look like. We may simply go on as we have been with diversity in our congregation and in our affiliations and not really having any sort of policy, or in the future we might want to have a policy about where we stand on this very important issue. I don't know. This is up to the congregation, and I'm just here to help educate us along what matters are at stake, and to help try to clear through some of the brush, some of the thorny brambles that can kind of snag us on our way to some semblance of factuality, right? And so the first session we spent our time talking about why we're talking about this, why it's important, and we talked about how this is an important issue. Whether or not churches end up in an affirming or non-affirming position, these are all things that we need to learn about, that we need to educate ourselves over. And again, the terminology affirming would be a church that affirms LGBTQ people in their orientation, their affectional or sexual orientation. And non-affirming would simply be those who think that it is not compatible with Christian practice to be a practicing, as it were, homosexual person. And so we are going to talk about, or we have been talking about, the issues involved to try to clear away some of the myths and try to latch on to what science, what scripture, what tradition has to say. Last 2 weeks ago, last week we talked about definitions. We talked about what does the LGBTQ stand for. We also talked about an extra T and an extra Q and an extra A, and as one of my friends has said, the alphabet soup of sexual and gender identity. So we won't rehash that today unless you have some questions, but I just wanted to recap a little bit before we get started. Yes?
Any chance we can get all the definitions?
Yeah, I can put that on a handout. Yes.
I got so confused.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, and that's okay, because we acknowledged for a while that this is mind-stretching, right? Especially when we talked about genderqueer identities, that to identify as genderqueer is to essentially opt out of the gender binaries that we sometimes, not sometimes, but that we all the time reinforce in society, that there is a between male and female, and sometimes people, especially younger people, feel like they have greater opportunity if they feel that their identity is not sufficiently expressed through gender norms, those binary gender norms. They will identify as queer and not feel like they have to choose between one or the other. So anyways, one of the things that we learned that's fundamental for understanding gender and sexuality as a spectrum rather than a set of binaries is that you have to separate these two issues. All right, that affectional or sexual orientation is a matter of sexuality, that who you were attracted to, and gender identity expression has to do with where you feel you fit in your own gender expression. These are two related but separate things. In addition to this, it was helpful for a number of folks to realize that physically, people don't always fall into male or female. That sometimes, and we're all adults here, sometimes people are born with ambiguous genitalia. And so that may very well be, there's also hormonal and chromosomal matters at work as well, in how people might identify themselves with respect to gender. I don't want to spend too much time here, I'm just recapping. So, in the midst of our mind stretching, because male and female is so deeply ingrained in our identity, we don't even have to think about it. It's invisible. Man, woman, we don't have to think about it, but when we have to think about it, it does feel like it's work. It's when we see someone that defies those gender norms, it is troubling. Not in any sort of moral sense necessarily, but just we're so used to identifying 99.999% of the population by our own constructions of masculinity and femininity, and then when we see someone who opts out of those binaries, it's unsettling. So again, we just have to keep educating ourselves. So one response is sort of alarm when we get all this. We feel flooded, and sometimes we respond to the humanizing of different people, that is, people who are different, by fearing that they're being raised to a saintly status. I use the example of a Thanksgiving conversation that I had with a relative. I was talking about racism, and they said, well, apparently blacks can do no wrong. And I was, no, that's not what I'm saying at all. And I don't even know how she had concluded that, but that's a common defense mechanism, that when we start to humanize people who are different, we tend to exaggerate and think that, oh, well, they must be saints, right? But to humanize, in part, is to perceive how others are susceptible to virtues and vices just like we ourselves are. Cutting away at these myths simply removes the smokescreen that the lies that are believed about people, so that we can get to the real issues. We're trying to get to the real issues, not the myths that sort of crop up to keep different people sort of at the margins. And we talked about that, right? That there were myths about slaves, that they were physically inferior. Myths about biblical myths like the curse of Ham or the mark of Cain, that theologians and Christians use to keep black people in their inferior status. We talk about women. Remember the anti-suffragette paintings that and cards that propaganda that I put up. The women all sitting in the bar smoking, neglecting their children, reading stock quotes and all that. And, it's like an anti-suffragette's greatest fear was that women would act like men, right? So we often, and there's the myth of primogeniture that if Eve was created second, then she must be subservient. Or because Eve was deceived, that means women are more gullible. These were traditions that were perpetuated throughout the centuries, okay? And we simply have to destroy these myths and get to the real issues, which, in the case of slavery, they're human. They're just like any other person. In the case of women, this is half the population. God made male and female, and they're equal. And so let's get to some LGBTQ myths. This is the slide where we ended last week. One myth about LGBTQ people is that they're sexually voracious, that they are hypersexualized. And so they often get branded as pedophiles, orgiasts, deviants. But the problem with that argument is that straight people aren't really, an exception here, that straight people can also be pedophiles, orgiasts, deviants. So you can't really single out LGBTQ people. And then, some people might respond, well, what about these gay pride parades? You see people dancing in their underwear, and, what about all that? You don't see that at Macy's, right? But at the same time, hypersexualized behaviors are among predictable possible outcomes, especially in those whose sexuality is considered deviant. All that to say, if you live in a society where people single you out and cast you out because of your sexuality, you can respond in primarily two ways: fight or flight. It's that reptilian response, right? It's physiological. And sometimes people will closet themselves, okay? Or feel unsafe to be who they are. Another time, when it comes to fighting, they will say, well, here, you don't like my sexuality? Well, here it is, up in your face. Okay, and sometimes they will actually become hypersexualized as a fight response to society. Another dynamic there is that oftentimes people will, gay people will choose to reject not just the moral norm that affects them, but all of society's moral norms. It's like it's like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? If this society rejects me for who I am, then forget any of it. It is no longer an authority on sexual matters whatsoever. And so they throw the baby out with the bathwater. And yet, this is only one possible outcome. Not all LGBTQ people are like this, okay? This is just one possible outcome. It's an unhealthy outcome, but it's provoked by a society that does not simply treat them civilly, in a civil manner, because of their orientation, okay? For example, I had a gay friend who said, they don't represent me. Those people in the pride parades who dance around in their underwear, that's not me. Okay, so it's not, we have to be careful about painting with broad strokes here. As a counter-narrative to the sexual veracity, the pursuit of marriage equality. If they're so promiscuous, if they're hypersexualized, why are so many of them trying to fight for marriage, trying to fight to be monogamous in committed relationships? This demonstrates the desire for that. So why are they interested? I think you have to ask yourself that. Or we have to ask ourselves that. The other phenomenon is celibates and gays who marry straight. There are homosexual Christians who believe that it's wrong to engage in a same-sex relationship, and so they remain celibate. Now, whether or not you agree with that, it still drives home the fact that these are not sexually voracious people, right? If they were, they wouldn't be celibate. In addition to that, gays who marry straight, I shared that I had read an article about a Mormon man who acknowledged his gay orientation and still decided, for the sake of being in accord with his religion, that he was going to marry a woman and even have children with this woman. All right, and he acknowledged, and his wife knows how he feels, but he felt like his religion was more important, and so he fell in line. But again, whether you agree with that or not, it's still a point against those who say that when people become same-sex loving, same-gender loving, they are doing so because they are hypersexualized, right? These are two or three counters to that narrative. Here's another myth. Gays are a modern phenomenon. Again, I'm using gays as an umbrella term, and we talked about how the term homosexuality is very clinical, and I still use that because it's still part of common parlance. And when we're talking about these things, sometimes we need a broad handle. So gays are a modern phenomenon. Some scholars have proposed, and can everybody see this okay? Is the, let me just check here if I can make this sharper. Okay. Some scholars have proposed that the first homosexual couple to be mentioned in history is the ancient Egyptian servants. I'm not going to try to pronounce that. I never got into Egyptology, so these two people who lived around 2400 BC. Okay. We have records in Greek and Roman writings of same-gender love and same-gender sexuality. More recently, in medieval to modern time, late medieval and modern times, Spanish explorer Cabeza de Vaca, 15th century explorer, mentions effeminate, as he called it, Native Americans in Florida who, quote, go about dressed as women and do women's tasks. Okay. There's also what is referred to as the Two-Spirit people, Native Americans who are documented in about 130 North American tribes. These are people who are actually viewed as blessed because of their gender and sexuality, that the God, they're actually special. Because they're so rare and they're different, many of these Native American tribes actually treated them as especially blessed by the gods, which is sort of the opposite of what you see in Western society. This I found interesting and only learned about recently. Thomas or Thomasine Hall, who was born in England and came to the New World, was assigned female identity but had ambiguous genitalia, and as an adult started to cross over. And actually would cross over quite often. When she or he came into the New World, settled in a town, and I'm just going to call her because that's what most of the literature does that I've encountered. She was questioned, obviously, by as far as her switching back and forth. And eventually was taken to court, and the Jamestown Quarter Court decided in 1629 that she was to be considered both male and female. And that was partly as a result of a physical examination. And so that was something that I thought interesting and quite close to home. Nicholas Biddle, who is one of the members of the Lewis and Clark team, recorded that among the Minnetarees, if a boy shows any symptom of effeminacy or girlish inclinations, he is put among the girls, dressed in their way, brought up with them, and sometimes married to men. So it's not so much that it's never happened. It's not a modern phenomenon. It's just that how these things make it into broader culture, how cultures are accepting or non-accepting, make a huge difference in the visibility of any social phenomenon, right? So this is not just a recent thing. It may feel like a recent thing because partly, I believe it was in the 1930s, that any sort of same-sex relationship or any innuendo was banned from entertainment up until, I believe, the late 60s. And so a lot of people from the baby boomers, the Great Generation, grew up without seeing this anywhere. And now society is much more open, although there's still a lot more openness to be had. Society is still more accepting of the visibility of LGBTQ people than it ever has been. So that's why it feels like a modern phenomenon. I've just lumped a few together here. There's a myth that runs this way: LGBTQ people want everyone to be gay. Have you ever heard this? I've heard it on the news. Simply not true. The closest you can ever come to that is that they are concerned with closeted people coming out of the closet, being themselves and being out. That's the closest you can possibly get to that. No, LGBTQ people simply want people to be themselves. Okay. Whether that's straight, gay, lesbian, whatever. Another myth is that AIDS is the gay plague. And this was very much due to the epidemic in New York and California during the late 70s, early 80s, which was very, well, to some degree, high profile. But the problem with that, that designation is that you also had a lot of heterosexuals, hemophiliacs, and heroin users, and at one time, Haitians returning from the Congo, where the strain began in the 60s. Haitians who did business in Congo, coming back to Haiti, and then emigrating to the U.S. or doing business in the U.S. That AIDS was not just for gay people. Okay, and that's pretty much common knowledge, but you still hear strands of that myth every once in a while. And this is still a hotly contested point of debate. It's a choice. That being gay or lesbian or bisexual is a choice. Already we know that whatever physiological differences we might take into consideration, there are also chromosomal and hormonal differences. And so there's lots of factors going on, and choice varies greatly. You can talk to a person who feels more fluid in their sexuality, like a bisexual person does, and then another person who says, well, I knew I was gay since I was 4. You know, that it didn't seem like a choice. You know, and if that seems like an odd idea, let me ask you, when did you feel like you were straight? I've read of instances where a lesbian had a very traumatic relationship with her partner, ended, and she became straight. How to explain that? I don't know. You hear all sorts of stories about ex-gay therapy or so-called reparative therapy. Some actually have gone into wedded straight marriages. Some people that has they've rejected that, and it only helped them to embrace their orientation. And scientists have showed that this is a very traumatic form of therapy, if you will. And so just trying to, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in a second, when you talk about choice and whether you can change someone's orientation, there are things that are way beyond our knowing. And not everyone is the same. Some people feel like there is more choice. I'm talking about people who describing their own experiences. Some people feel like there is some choice. Some people feel like there's no choice at all. Just like for many of us feeling like we never decided we were going to be straight, right? That's still very much a mystery, but the fact that it's a choice, I think, is still worthy of the designation myth, okay? Because it's not a simple choice. And over and over and over again, we hear stories of LGBT people, particularly LGBT people, describing their wishing to be straight. They grew up in a conservative church. They start to feel like they're gay, and they don't know what to do. They want to get rid of it. They pray. I've known people who've been suicidal, okay? Suicidal, depressive, wishing that they could be straight so that they could conform to their family's expectations, their church's expectations, even society's expectations, and just either acting out in very unhealthy ways, either rejecting everything or doing harm to themselves. And we talked about that study in our first week about how teens who grow up with a lower concentration of affirming churches actually have higher rates of at-risk youth behavior. Okay. And so right now I wanted to share one story about the lengths to which someone might go to try to, as they say, pray the gay away. This is a book by Mel White called Stranger at the Gate, To Be Gay and Christian in America. I'm sorry?
Therapy.
Okay. Mel White, let me just give you some background, was regarded by the leaders of the religious right as one of their most talented and productive supporters. He penned the speeches of Ollie North. He was a ghostwriter for Jerry Falwell. He worked with Jim Baker, flew in Pat Robertson's private jet, walked sandy beaches with Billy Graham. But what these men didn't know, and what Mel White tried very hard to get rid of, was that even though he was an evangelical minister and committed Christian and family man, he was also gay. Okay. Let me share a brief portion of the time leading up to his coming out. Even in those times of longing, I was grateful for the overabundance of gifts God had given me. I enjoyed filmmaking, writing, teaching, and preaching. The occasional prizes and honors that came my way were gratifying. I was thankful for our good life and the luxuries we shared. Having Lila and my wonderful family had given me great joy. But even their loving presence could only temporarily ease the painful longing and temporarily postpone the inevitable crises. Gradually, I came to realize that there were limits to my restraint, and as the years passed, I grew closer and closer to that time when I would reach those limits. I felt longing, compounded by guilt and terror, whenever I stood to teach or preach before rows and rows of handsome seminarians. When young gay Christian men from Fuller or from my congregation came to me for counsel, I referred them immediately, but lived with fear that they might see the longing in my own eyes. After 25 years of denial, I was taking Valium just to get back on an airplane or through the night in another distant hotel. And when other gay travelers smiled silent invitations at me across a busy lobby or as we passed in the street, I felt my resistance weakening. Still, I was determined to keep my commitments to God, to Lila, and to my children at any price. I loved them. I wanted to stay with them. It wasn't their fault that I had needs they couldn't meet. I didn't want them to suffer because of my immaturity or lack of will. So not knowing what else to do, after 10 years of prayerful Christian insight therapy, I decided to take a whole new course. Counseling based on the premise of, if you have enough faith, God can do anything. That was only a temporary solution. In fact, as the years passed, it only made matters worse to hope for so much, to try so hard, to struggle so long, to believe so desperately, only to realize again that my sexual orientation was unchanged. So I decided to try another strategy to save my marriage and my family. At Fuller, again, this is the same Fuller I graduated from. At Fuller, I met a Christian psychologist who was a self-avowed practicing behaviorist. He made another kind of promise. He said, if you have enough faith in yourself, he said, you can do anything. During the next week, we discussed the options. I was desperate. I wanted to try any cure to overcome my homosexuality. When I suggested electric shock, he frowned, but didn't try to dissuade me. The counselor asked me to bring to our next session a selection of pictures from magazines or advertisements of men whose face or form aroused me, and also asked me to bring photos of myself that I found attractive. And though it embarrassed me to do it, I spent several hours that next week cutting out pictures of handsome men from Time and Life magazines and from full-page ads in the Los Angeles Times. I even robbed our family album of a picture that Lila had taken of me at Laguna Beach. I was standing in front of a little cottage we had rented for a week's vacation that last summer. I had blonde hair in those days, lots of it, at least more than I have now. And I was tanned, trim, and healthy. At my next appointment, into my pile of male photos, my counselor mixed pictures he had brought of models, actresses, and famous women of great beauty. Maybe he asked me to bring those photos too, I can't remember. Then he attached several electric cables to my body and placed a box with a dial in my hands. I was to shock myself whenever I felt stimulated in any way by a picture of a man. And I was to stop shocking myself immediately when the picture of a beautiful woman appeared. I could control the strength and the duration of the electric shock. Needless to say, I was desperate enough in those days to turn the dial up until I thought my hair would stand on end. Maybe that's how I lost it. Electric shock was painful, and looking back, I might feel truly angry at the long, pointless process if it all weren't so pathetic. Believe me, electric shock didn't work to change, or as they say now, to repair my sexual orientation. In fact, I remember being attracted to the therapist graduate assistant even as I sat in the behaviorist office turning up the juice. After 3.5 years as senior pastor of Covenant Church in Pasadena, I resigned. My excuse was simple. I wanted to make films and write full-time, but it wasn't true. In fact, by 1977, I was teetering on the edge of a complete nervous breakdown. I had held my homosexuality in check for 25 years. Besides being a husband and a father, I was writing, filmmaking, pastoring, preaching, and traveling nonstop across the country, trying desperately to please God and chalk up credits in God's little book on my behalf. I still believe that if I could do enough good, I still believed that if I could do enough good for the world, God would forgive my homosexual thoughts, but the plan wasn't working. Instead of managing to pull myself together, I was falling apart. So, shock therapy. Mel White eventually came out, and his wife actually, his ex-wife actually writes the foreword for the book and talks about how they parted. Bishop Gene Robinson, if you've heard of him, the first gay Episcopal bishop, I believe, in the Episcopal Church, had a similar situation where he was married and they had a ceremony before God and the church to release each other of their vows. But all this to say, does this sound like a choice to you? When someone is willing to undergo shock therapy, sometimes people are willing to kill themselves because of something that they feel does not comport with their surroundings. Gays versus Christians. And we've already talked about this before, but this is another myth, that many LGBTQ people identify as Christians. Mel White would be one. So many others. There's actually a gay Christian network. And this was started by Justin Lee, who grew up Southern Baptist. I've told you about him before. And they are a gathering of both what they call Side A and Side B Christians. Side A would be affirming LGBTQ people. Side B are LGBTQ people, well, I would say LGB people, maybe even some Q, I don't know, but people who identify with a same gender orientation, but feel like they're called to celibacy. That is how they understand their faith. But the GCN conference, the Gay Christian Network Conference, is one of the largest Christian conferences. And last week we played the story of, why am I blanking out? Timothy, the guy who pretended to be gay for a year. Again, I don't agree with his methods. He had to lie to his loved ones for a whole year, but his story is really interesting, I think, in walking into an LGBT community center and walking into a praise service on karaoke night. You may not agree with it, or you may, but we need to start asking questions when people who seem to be evidencing the fruit of the Spirit start to say that they're Christian. Questions? Not all at once.
It appears to me that the person who says, I am gay, but I will be celibate, is, to me, is saying, it's not right for me to be gay.
That's true.
So
Well, no, I'm sorry. That there's a difference. They actually will say, for the most part, it is okay for me to be gay, but it is not okay for me to engage in, for lack of a better term, gay behavior. Does that make sense?
To me, that's not, it's still saying, I can't engage in
Right.
who I am.
They would be non-affirming. But they believe, but they have come to understand that this is who they are. And the only reason I mention it because this is part of educating ourselves about these issues, but also because their example, whether we agree with it or not, their example is one more argument against the idea that gay people are sexually voracious, right? Because here are these folks who are being celibate.
One more comment.
Sure.
When I hear that, I am this, but I will not practice my sexuality, I'm made to think of our Catholic friends
Sure.
who go into convents and go into monasteries
Nuns, priests, monks. Yeah.
and deny their sexuality in that way. But that's because they don't feel that sexuality is the highest, expressing sexuality is the highest in living.
Yeah, and there are some who will say, on the one hand, this is only part of my identity. There are others, or the same folks will also say, we are called by God to experience intimacy in different ways through the family of faith, and and how fulfilling that is. There are others. There was a chaplain at Wheaton College, which is an evangelical Christian college in the Chicago area, suburbs of Chicago, Wheaton, Illinois. And actually that's the alma mater of Billy Graham. There was a chaplain at Wheaton recently who was a side B Christian. She believed that she should remain celibate, and she's even done a Q talk. Q is like the evangelical answer to TED Talks. She did a Q talk talking about how fulfilling it was to experience intimacy in other ways, through friendship, through sisterhood, through mentorship, things like that. She has recently come out as side A and left her position at Wheaton. Because for many people, the gift, as many Christians call it, the gift of celibacy, whether straight, gay, whatever, is not always a gift. Sometimes, on the other hand, you hear people saying it's not good for someone to be alone, right? Like Adam. It is better, in Paul's words, it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Especially, and this is big for David Gushee, the Baptist ethicist who recently came out as affirming and wrote a book about it. If we have to choose between suicide and depression on the one hand, and just encouraging our LGBTQ people, brothers and sisters, to get married, it's not a hard decision. And he says, even if you think it's a sin, even if you're non-affirming, which would you choose? Your child, killing themselves or living a life of loneliness and depression, or living with, if that's your perspective, the sin of homosexuality happy with another person, you know. To me, that's a no-brainer. Of course, you know, Christians might say, well, let's do with none of the sin, and you know, but that's a very, very difficult road to travel, and you know. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes. Ed and Billy.
Yeah, Daniel, you mentioned that one of the myths is that all gays want everybody to be gay.
Mm-hmm.
Where I think this comes into play in the church is if an openly gay person joins the church
Mm-hmm.
and says, I want to teach Sunday school.
Mm-hmm.
Does that myth suddenly, no matter how affirming people may want to be,
Mm-hmm.
does that myth rear its ugly head? And people think that, no, you can't be a Sunday school teacher because you're going to
Sure.
try to convert my children.
Yeah, I'm a big proponent of churches, if they decide to become openly welcoming and affirming, that if they do develop a statement of inclusion, which in our current climate, these churches should, they need to state specifically that no one will be barred from any position in the church with respect. No one will be discriminated against for any position in the church for their sexual orientation or gender identity or expression. These, again, this relates to degrees of acceptance, right? The Episcopal Church really struggled with this. Okay, we'll have gay priests, but we can't have gay bishops. You know? The Anglican Church similarly struggled with this with regards to women not too long ago. And so there are always going to be degrees of acceptance, but I really do think that, especially as Baptists, where we say, you know, every member a minister, priesthood of believers, if you believe that this is being gay, broad definition, is compatible with and even celebratory within Christian tradition and practice, then you got to go all the way. Again, this is not making them a saint; it's just making them like us. You know, turning that us and them into just us. Right. So, Billy.
As you were reading quotes from the book, reminded me of what Jimmy Carter said a long time ago. He picked up a Playboy and he said he lusted in his heart. Good Southern Baptist Christian, good man, farmer, man of the earth. As I heard this fellow's confessions, and I think it goes back to Ed's question, there's a difference between love and lust. He said as he was getting the shock treatments, he was looking at the young receptionist, and with heterosexual men, I would dare say, men as rule see a beautiful, voluptuous woman. It affects different men different ways. Does it mean you don't still love your wife? So I guess with me, it's that difference between love and lust. And just one more quick story. My baby, who is 23 now, her best friends growing up had a traditional household, mother and dad. They divorced. Mom married another woman. My baby continued to go over to their house. And I had thoughts about it, but I never worried about it because I knew the girl's mother was a good woman. I wasn't afraid she was going to see something that was untoward because I knew this was a loving mother, loved the woman that she married. So to me, it's that line between love and lust. So just observation.
Yeah, it's an important distinction. Absolutely. But the point with Mel White's testimony, I think, is that for all of this treatment, all the longing, all the therapy, all the praying, it still didn't change his orientation. That's really the salient point that I was trying to make. But the difference between love and lust, yeah, I want to just reiterate, and I've said this before, that we're not talking about sexual licentiousness. We're not talking about sexual relativity. This is whether LGBTQ people can be Christian. And that would mean whether they would be invited, just like any straight Christian would, into the opportunities of Christian marriage that many of us enjoy.
And I get that. I didn't mean to deviate from that at all.
Okay.
But I was just doing the comparison with straight people.
Mhm.
They do this. The
Right.
sin, what is the sin? Is the sin that you love someone? Or is the sin, and I'm sure you're going to go there down the road, but
Mhm. Mhm.
what is the sin?
Right. Yeah. That's really a helpful distinction there. That where is the sin, and that's really what we're trying to get at. Okay, well, we have probably 6 minutes, 4 minutes, to start this week's session. And I will breeze through some of this because it's fairly straightforward. We want to talk about the Bible, and we'll examine Paul and Leviticus next week, and maybe have to finish this as well. But I want to talk about, as a segue, okay? We've just been talking about myths. Here's a biblical myth, okay? Sodom and Gomorrah, okay? The term sodomy, in particular. What does the Bible actually have to say about Sodom and Gomorrah? What did they do so wrong? Remember, God came down to judge Sodom and Gomorrah way before the Lot episode. The Lot episode being the mob trying to get at the angels, right? And evidencing same-sex lust there, okay? Let's just read this really fast. Here's the Lot episode. But before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, both young and old, all the people to the last man surrounded the house, that is where Lot lived with his 2 angelic visitors. And they called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may know them." And everybody agrees, whatever position you take, they take, scholars agree that this is knowing in the biblical sense, right, of sexual relations. Okay. Lot went out to the door, out of the door to the men, shut the door after him, and said, "I beg you, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Look, I have 2 daughters who have not known a man. Let me bring them out to you, and do to them as you please. Only do nothing to these men, for they have come under the shelter of my roof." But they replied, "Stand back." And they said, "This fellow came here as an alien, and he would play the judge. Now we will deal worse with you than with them." And they pressed hard against the man Lot and came near the door to break it down. And so this is how centuries of tradition have sort of branded Sodom and Gomorrah, that they were judged for their homosexuality. Okay. Even though God was coming to judge them before, who knows, maybe it was, right? Well, here's what the Bible has to say about Sodom. In these passages, Sodom is equated with disobedient Israel. And Israel, it's never mentioned, by the way, Israel is never condemned for homosexuality. Okay. If you can think of an example, please let me know, but I cannot find one. Israel is likened to Sodom in terms of their general disobedience and impending judgment. Israel's hypocritical worship. They're likened to Sodom because there is no justice in the streets, but there's all this piety in the temple. Okay. Isaiah 1, great chapter to read to understand Israel's God's judgment on Israel. Israel's corrupt leadership. For corrupt leadership, they are likened to Sodom. Israel's false prophets are likened to Sodom. Destruction of proud enemies. Babylon, Edom, I believe. And the New Testament writings use Sodom and Gomorrah as a symbol of destruction, except for Jude 1:7. We'll probably have to get to that next week. I just want to close on this passage because I think it's very salient. So, Don't worry, these 2 slides, and they're just scripture, okay? And then I'll make a point and we'll be done. You are the daughter of your mother, talking to Israel. This is Ezekiel 16. You are the daughter of your mother who loathed her husband and her children, and you are the sister of your sisters who loathed their husbands and their children. Your mother was a Hittite, and your father was an Amorite. Not very nice to foreigners, but your elder sister is Samaria, who lived with her daughters to the north of you, and your younger sister, who lived to the south of you, is Sodom with her daughters. You not only followed their ways and acted according to their abominations, within a very little time you were more corrupt than they in all your ways. Here's the kicker. As I live, says the Lord God, your sister Sodom and her daughters have not done as you and your daughters have done. This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me, therefore I removed them when I saw it. The one place in the Old Testament that really spells out in great detail what the sin of Sodom is, it's because they had all this blessing and they didn't share it with those who needed it. That's why I like to say there's more of Park Avenue in Sodom. There's more Sodom in Park Avenue than San Francisco. And yet, for centuries, sodomy has been equated with homosexual behavior. Or sexuality, I should say. Okay, I'm tempted to go on to Jude, because Jude is the one example, but there's a twist there. We'll just have to come to it next week. Thank you again for coming. Next week again is the part 2 of the biblical witness, and the following week, the 27th, we will take off for Christmas, and then we'll meet again on the 3rd in the new year. So we'll hopefully see you next week. And please take your conversations outside so the choir.